Good morning, welcome. I'm Lauren Reese, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Wilson Center and our partners for today's event at the Center for Climate and Security, it's my privilege to welcome you all to the Wilson Center for this morning's discussion on China's climate security vulnerabilities. For those of you joining the Wilson Center for the first time, I'll say a quick word about us. The Wilson Center was mandated by Congress to unite to bridge policy, practice, and research. It's home to about 20 programs that focus on different regions or topics. Together, we cover every corner of the globe and today's most pressing issues. Our China Environment Forum and Kissinger Institute on China and the United States are two programs that really exemplify the standout work of the center, and you're all in for a treat with Robert Daly and Jennifer Turner both on today's panel. It's also such a pleasure to welcome Erin Sikorsky back to the Wilson Center with her colleagues at the Center for Climate and Security. Thank you, Erin, for your inspiration to co-host today's event and for letting us borrow the title of your report. The program I direct, the Environmental Change and Security Program, or ECSP, works to help the foreign policy, international development, and security communities to recognize and respond to the ways that environmental issues can shape and are shaped by the issues that those communities are focused on. In some ways, the urgency of climate change has heightened awareness of these connections, and the Biden administration has certainly worked to integrate climate considerations across the U.S. government to strengthen U.S. leadership on climate change and to shift the landscape for private sector investment in the renewable energy transition. This new terrain requires new ways of analyzing risk and identifying potential responses. It also requires new modes of cooperation to ensure that no one is left behind in our climate response efforts. But we're not just living in a time increasingly reshaped by climate change, we're in an era often referred to as strategic competition, where China is considered a pacing challenge by the U.S. Department of Defense. So today's discussion is focused on China's climate security vulnerabilities. My definition of climate security, and you'll get different definitions depending on who you talk to, but my definition includes the impacts of and responses to climate change that alter the social, political, economic, and environmental systems that underpin human security and global stability. It's hard to talk about addressing climate change and climate security without talking about China, whether the country's leading role as a greenhouse gas emitter or its corner on the critical minerals market that's so critical to the renewable energy transition. But China also covers a huge and diverse geography. It's home to nearly 20% of the global population and is in itself is in no ways immune to the impacts of climate change, either at home or in its dealings abroad. One of the hallmarks of climate change is how difficult it can be to predict the specificity of its impacts in a given place. But we can improve our predictive capabilities by understanding better the existing environmental and physical vulnerabilities in that place, its social and political context, its regional and transboundary dynamics, and how different decisions made at different levels can have cascading consequences, good or bad. Erin's report lays out how climate change will interact with much of this context, and I'm going to turn things over to her in just a minute to share her findings and kick off our discussion. But first, let me introduce our panel. I'll start from the far left. Robert Daly is the director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. He's been working on USChina Relations since the late 80s when he was a cultural exchanges officer at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. Since that time, he's directed the University of Maryland China Initiative and served as American Director of the Johns Hopkins University Nanjing University Center for Chinese and American Studies in Nanjing. He also worked on television and theater projects in China as a host, actor, and writer, and helped produce the Chinese language version of Sesame Street, which I think is one of the best, facts that a person could have about themselves. Greg Pollock is the Principal Director for Arctic and Global Resilience Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, where he has served for over a decade in a number of leadership positions. From 2019 to 2021, Greg served as the Secretary of Defense Chair on the faculty of the National War College, where he taught courses on national security strategy, U.S.-China relations, and the implications of climate change for national security. I'm glad he could be here with us today, given where he sits at DoD, but also for the deep expertise he's gleaned over many years of focusing on this connection of issues. Erin Sikorsky is the director of the Center for Climate and Security and the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Erin was previously deputy director of the Strategic Futures Group on the National Intelligence Council, where she led the U.S. intelligence community's environmental and climate security analysis. She's a leading voice on climate security and a prolific writer, and you should all follow her on Twitter. That's my plug for her. It's an important one. Jennifer Turner has served as director of the Wilson Center's China Environment Forum for 23 years. She's a highly regarded expert on U.S.-China environmental cooperation, as well as China's climate-related challenges and governance issues. She's long played a critical role in this space, facilitating exchanges on energy and environment between U.S. and Chinese NGOs, government officials, and researchers, and producing cutting-edge analysis on the energy and environmental challenges facing China. A few quick housekeeping notes. The session is being recorded and live streamed on our website. Those of you watching online should feel free to submit questions at any point in the conversation using the box below the video that you're watching. For those of you in the room, we'll have a Q&A towards the last third of the session. When I call on you, please be sure to speak into a mic. You're going to just push that button until it's green. And speak into the mic so that those online will be able to hear you. Please also share your name and affiliation, and I'll remind you when we get to that point as well. And that's also for all of you on the panel. I think you're all sort of experienced at this, so just remember to push your button. Okay, Erin, so why don't you start by walking us through the findings of your report?
Sure. Thank you so much, Lauren, and thanks to the Wilson Center. It's always a pleasure to partner with you. It's really nice to be here in person, and I'm really looking forward to learning from my fellow panelists today and your deep expertise on these topics. I thought what I would do in my opening remarks is both tell you why we at the Center for Climate and Security decided to do this research and write this paper, and then what some of the key findings are. And if you're not familiar with the center, we are a nonprofit, a nonpartisan research institute based here in Washington that explores this nexus of climate change and national security, really coming at it from a national security perspective, and have been around for a little over a decade. We're an institute of a larger group called the Council on Strategic Risks. So why this paper? As Lauren said, obviously China and climate change are two of the top national security issues for this administration. She referenced Secretary of Defense Austin's remarks calling China the pacing threat, right, for the United States. But we've seen the president, the DNI, again, Secretary Austin, all refer to climate change in stark terms, that it affects everything the Pentagon does, that it's an existential threat to the United States and to its allies. So with that, what we found, though, was that the conversation in Washington security circles around climate change and China was very binary often, right? It was either the U.S. cooperates or it competes with China. Either the U.S. focuses on climate change or it focuses on China. You can't do both. The conversation was very focused on mitigation and cutting emissions, and in some cases had even devolved into this, will they, won't they for China, and what are they going to do, and that should drive our behavior, to the point where you had some members of Congress last year proposing legislation that the U.S. should pause its commitments to cutting emissions until China showed that it would cut its emissions, right? So a very unhealthy, frankly, conversation, and missing a lot of the dynamics here. So we wanted to contribute in the security world of reframing the conversation a bit around China and climate change, because we think it's really important to understand the security risks that are facing China itself from climate, because A, that's going to shape, I think, Chinese behavior on the world stage, and if the United States wants to understand Chinese motivations, in some case, you have to be able to bring a climate lens to that discussion. Also, I think it will help the United States understand opportunities and risks in its relationship and competition with China. And so building a better understanding of again, how China itself is viewing climate security, but also what the risks are, we thought was helpful. And that drove this report. And I think Jennifer, she participated in one of the roundtables that informed this report, and it was definitely a team effort with a lot of expertise from different sectors in informing this work. So what did we find? Very briefly, obviously we found that China's senior leadership recognizes climate change as a national security threat. Under the current leadership, China has adopted a broad concept of national security that really encompasses both internal and external and traditional and non-traditional threats. It was less clear in our research the extent to which ecological and climate security topics have permeated Chinese military strategy and doctrine, though public documents and statements provide some indication, at least, that the People's Liberation Army is at least considering climate implications in some of its planning and its work. And clearly, the military is a key responder in China to climate hazards and disasters. When we looked at the categories of risk that China is facing, we came up with 3 general categories of climate security risk, which frankly are the same categories we see when we look at the United States or really any country facing climate hazards. The first category we talked about were direct risks, right, of the climate hazards themselves to military and critical infrastructure. Things like coastal shipyards, islands in the South China Sea, railways and energy infrastructure built on permafrost, and the highly populated southern river deltas. All of these places are at risk from climate hazards themselves and have already experienced climate hazards in many cases, flooding, for example, in some of the river deltas, melting permafrost, undermining some of the railways. So they're happening now. The second bucket of risks, if you will, are what we would call compounding risks, where a climate hazard plus something else, right, impact or threaten internal political stability, potentially. We saw this as climate change threatens food and water security across the country and has the potential to exacerbate inequality. We see potential for strains on government response as they're being asked again and again to respond to hazards, and the risk of increasing pressure on already marginalized populations in ways that again, the literature on climate security and research that's been done in other parts of the world shows that this kind of strain can contribute to risks of political instability. And then the third category of risk we found was external, right? Geopolitical. So that as climate change increases competition over shared resources and amplifies tensions with China's neighbors, many of whom are even more exposed than China to climate impacts, it can shift the landscape for China internationally and pose geopolitical risks there. And I'll talk about a little bit what we saw at the COP27 meeting last fall in the conversation between around loss and damage, and I think that previewed some of what China might face going forward, as well as the United States and others, right? This isn't China alone. Another thing we looked at in the report then is, okay, if those are the risks, how do we see China responding? And what we found is that its approach to climate security risks largely mirrors its approach to other perceived major challenges, right? First and foremost, we see them pursuing extensive infrastructure and public works interventions, really on a scale that you don't see anywhere else in the world. It's also boosting its disaster response capabilities, including in the military. At the same time, we see the government trying to muzzle or minimize public critiques and concerns. And then on the international front, we see China trying to take advantage of the issue to advance its position vis-a-vis its neighbors and in competition with the United States by casting itself as a leader and a partner on climate concerns on the world stage, particularly in its neighborhood with the Pacific Islands, right, and reaching out to countries that say they have concerns about climate. As I mentioned, though, I think there is uncertainty regarding all of these responses and whether they are adequate or not, and we go into more detail about this in the paper. First, on the one hand, as I said, the response to the direct risks is really quite impressive, right? China has a national climate adaptation plan. We here in the United States do not. They've got these huge public works projects related to water. However, what we see from climate science is that the hazards are coming more quickly and more intensely than scientists previously predicted. So even in a country like China, where they've clearly planned ahead and invested a lot, I think there's the risk that they're overwhelmed by how fast some of these hazards come, and there's more risk there than they expect. The second uncertainty is what I would call, and what we call in the paper, competence versus politics, right? And the example I look at here is the SARS outbreak in 2007, where after that outbreak, China on paper developed an emergency response law, which was really excellent, right? It was really a model. It was a tiered response of coordination at the local level of all resources. They built a national early warning system, and it meant that on paper, China had a robust response in place to the initial COVID-19 outbreak. except that what was on paper didn't actually happen in real life because there was political considerations that prevented, in some cases, the implementation of such a response. There was no incentives for reporting bad news up the chain, right? The political incentives weren't there. And so they didn't actually implement immediately this response to the initial outbreak in Wuhan. And I think you see similar parallels potentially with climate response as well. The third uncertainty is what I mentioned before, this dynamic between the global south and the global north and the divide over climate finance. I think it's increasingly challenging for China to maintain its position as a leader or representative of the global south and not contribute more to climate finance and contribute more to cutting emissions. You saw this again at the COP, where you had the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda actually call China a, quote, major polluter that could no longer expect a free pass on contributing to climate finance. And the fact that he called that out publicly, I think, is a sign that there's shifting dynamics there. And with the final agreement at COP on loss and damage, or what the global north owes the global south, developing countries agreed that it would focus that funding on, quote, the most vulnerable, i.e. not China. and that, I think, was, again, a sign that there's uncertainty about whether China can really play the climate card as much geopolitically going forward. So I'm going to end just with a few thoughts on recommendations for the United States, because that was the goal at the end of the paper, right? What does the U.S. do with all of this, and where do they need to focus? And we had 5 recommendations. Very briefly, we thought, first, the U.S. needs to build a better understanding of China's physical climate risks, as Lauren said, leveraging predictive capabilities and better data to build a better understanding of China and the greater Indo-Pacific. Then we need to leverage, number 2, we need to leverage forecasting tools to explore these key uncertainties vis-a-vis China's climate security response. So on the one hand, it's really good to get that data and predictive capability about what physical hazards to expect, but then we need to marry it with uncertainties about the politics and socio-political issues. Third, we recommended the creation of a whole-of-government China climate security working group. We think that officials focused on China will craft more effective policies if they're integrating experience across different agencies together and not siloing climate folks in one office and China folks in another, but instead working together. We think the U.S. needs to prioritize climate adaptation and resilience programs for Indo-Pacific allies and partners to really distinguish the U.S. as the partner of choice in the region and take advantage, frankly, of this opportunity where countries are realizing that China is a big part of the problem when it comes to climate change. And then finally, we also recommend that the U.S. explore areas of mutual climate security interest with China, because we assess that climate-driven instability in China may have ripple effects that negatively affect U.S. national security, such as interruption of supply chains, regional instability, or more aggressive Chinese behavior over shared resources. So we should look for opportunities that go beyond emissions reductions negotiations for potential cooperation with China in addressing such risks. Because again, as Lauren said, we can't do this alone, and there are opportunities here to deepen the relationship in ways to address some of these risks as well. So that was a lot of talking for me. I'll stop there. But I really look forward to the conversation and questions, and again, hearing from you all and your reactions and comments.
Thank you, Erin. You managed to capture a lot more of it than I thought you would be able to in 8 minutes. That was wonderful. Robert, I'm going to pass it over to you. I want to get your reflections on Erin's report and her remarks, given what you know about how China assesses and responds to risk, and what, from your position, what you would expect to see as climate impacts increase.
Thank you, Lauren, and Erin. Thank you to you and your team. I greatly enjoyed reading the report, learned a lot from it. I am not an environmental expert. Most of the panels up here, I work on US-China relations, mostly on the security side, and so I'll be coming in at these questions from that extremely depressing angle before handing off to the rest of you. Certainly, China has always had what we would now call a very holistic view of security that comprised environmental factors. Going back to Yu the Great in 2000, he's one of the founding sort of god kings of China. He tamed the floodwaters, and the cycles of Chinese history had to do with droughts and earthquakes and floods and subsequent wars, which then overthrew dynasties. So this consciousness that you're calling for is really woven in to the fabric within China. It was the droughts in China that would bring the Mongols raiding north. So always a very holistic approach to security. That's imposing a current category, holistic, on Chinese history. But always, this approach to security was always within the sinosphere, within the known world for the Chinese. But really, since the Opium War and China's defeat at the hands of the British, military threats from outside of the sinosphere have dominated China's thinking about security, and I think have recontextualized that to a considerable degree. And today, when we think about China's approach to security, even though it comprises traditional and non-traditional threats in the way that you lay out, I think there's no question but that for Beijing's leaders, the top threat comes from the global West, and in particular, from the United States. The report points out that China's national climate adaptation strategy calls climate change a, quote, important non-traditional security factor for China. Yes, an important non-traditional security factor, but not an existential threat. And increasingly for Beijing, the United States is seen as an existential threat. Given what China's leaders believe and what they have heard and seen from the United States, I think it is actually quite reasonable for Xi Jinping and his colleagues to say that, to believe that whatever we may say, our China policy is containment, regime change, and a threat to what China sees as its territorial integrity in Taiwan. And these are the main drivers for thinking about security day in and day out in Beijing. So as I was reading this report, one of my big questions was, what is the overall context in which we, say your number 3 recommendation, especially, create a whole of government China climate security working group? Against which background assumptions, right? And I think that the emergent, I think it's really already here, framework, and this is where it gets really depressing, is that we are engaged in a new kind of Cold War with China. I realize that's retrograde, it's dismal, it's going to be long-term, fantastically wasteful, expensive, and dangerous, but I think here we are, and that is the condition against which Chinese-U.S. competition and cooperation on combating climate change and all the other associated areas, food scarcity, whatever it may be, is going to be viewed for the foreseeable future in both capitals. It's not just Washington. This is the first set of questions are going to be traditional geostrategic questions about U.S.-China competition. And so against that background, China's, the threats, for example, that you point out to China's man-made military islands in the South China Sea, Washington will say, oh, that's nice. That's not something that we're particularly interested in mitigating. Threats to China's coastal and delta-based military facilities, bonus. Nothing not to like here from a traditional security point of view. In fact, it might even be something which we directly or indirectly can weaponize. So again, are these the questions that the joint group is looking at, or are we looking at mitigation? I think we need to be pretty clear-eyed about that right up front. We, the United States, may in fact favor China's need to dedicate fewer resources to direct military competition in order to focus on its climactic threats and the associated threats to the economy and social stability in China. And China will feel the same way, as the United States is distracted from an arms race by the need to mitigate climate change. This strategic framework isn't necessarily conducive to close cooperation. Both sides may seek strategic advantages, moreover, in the international arena based on the other's climate policies. And we already see this starting to happen. The United States, for example, can use China's management of the Himalayan watershed resources, the river politics. We can use that to strengthen our relations with India and with Southeast Asian countries at China's expense. Okay, this is not a cooperative angle. China may see opportunities emerging in Siberia for increasing its food supply as more land there becomes arable. We are already seeing a desire from the Xi Jinping administration to wed his new interest in security diplomacy. And his new security diplomacy push is not about military so much as policing, working with other countries, this is particularly in Central Asia, but in Africa and other places as well, to build up their domestic policing capacity using Chinese technologies as well as Chinese methods. This can be relatively easily melded with combating climate change within countries using the databases that China proposes. So they can enhance some of their major security diplomacy, especially in the global south. Jennifer, you were just out in Central Asia. I'll be going to Central Asia soon, and so this is one of the things I'll be looking at there. And this has led to a somewhat ugly question, but I'm hearing it raised more and more in Washington. And Aaron, the report is obviously cognizant of this. Can competition between the United States and China, and increasingly their partners and allies, can their competition to lead on combating the effects of climate change, even if competition is sort of weaponized in a new Cold War context, can that competition to lead, might that be actually more effective in mitigating climate change than direct competition based on a more friendly recognition of a common threat? Should we necessarily oppose a competitive approach if it gets better impacts than I think what probably all of us would like to see in the first instance, which is two mature superpowers recognizing a common threat, setting aside difficulties to work for the good of humanity? There's very little sign of that on the horizon. What we do know right now is that Washington and Beijing are currently deepening their focus on military threats to security, and that this is making meaningful direct cooperation on combating climate change impossible, especially from the Chinese side, which refuses to work on transboundary issues unless, what they're really saying is unless the United States shuts up. They would really love it if we would just shut up. Criticizing Tibet and Xinjiang and Hong Kong or whatever it may be, but they're simply not willing anymore to work with the United States and what they see as a sort of a simultaneous tap on the shoulder, rabbit punch to the ribs approach that they feel, from American diplomacy. They're not going to cooperate, and that can't be wished away. And so that's, I think, what sort of the next step, looking at these excellent recommendations, is deepening them in light of this strategic context. How? Because you can't just bring the environmentalists, the climate change people into the room with the hard security people unless there's some contextualizing of the strategic framework. It'll be what the Chinese call, ducks conversing with chickens. They'll just be going past each other. So I'm sorry to be the voice of doom and gloom. But again, I thank you very much for the report, and I hope it proves to be a good springboard for deepening these discussions.
Thank you, Robert. You did what you promised. Came in like a storm cloud. Jennifer, originally we talked about you going third, but I was going to have Greg and then, okay.
Still security people out there first.
Okay, yeah, and then you can bring us around. All right, Greg, over to you.
Terrific. I'll just start with congratulations to our close friend and colleague, Aaron, and the Center on Climate and Security for the very thoughtful report. And thanks also to Lauren and the Wilson Center for inviting me to participate in the discussion at this intersection of two of the most consequential issues of our time, that is US-China relations and global climate change. And I think Aaron has laid out the real difficulties with the latter issue. Robert's already laid out the difficulties with the former issue in terms of US-China relations. And so when you stack them on top of each other, you've really got quite a tangle to try to unspool. But I will note that, as the prior speakers have noted, too often these issues are kept in separate silos as if they didn't interact with each other, that this climate challenge could be dealt with without really interacting with the China problem and vice versa. Of course, that couldn't be farther from the truth. As Lauren noted, I'm here representing the new Office of Arctic and Global Resilience within the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. For the first time, this new office gives a kind of locus for climate security concerns inside of the Pentagon. I think that's really an important step forward, and we are working very closely with our colleagues in the regional offices across OSD policy and the wider interagency community to start to move past the dynamic that Robert alluded to, that is, ducks talking with chickens, and that, the climate security people need to understand the dynamics of the relationship with China and vice versa. So conversations like this, I think, really make a contribution. I think I want to note up front that despite the tenor of public debate, U.S. policy is that we are not seeking confrontation with the People's Republic of China, and we do not believe that the conflict with the PRC is either imminent nor inevitable. That said, as Lauren mentioned in her introductory remarks, the National Defense Strategy is clear that the PRC is the most consequential strategic competitor of the United States and the pacing challenge for the Department of Defense. Now, in an ideal world, governments would compete responsibly where their interests diverge, as is the case on many issues with respect to Sino-American relations right now. and then cooperate where they converge, as they do with respect to a lot of transboundary challenges, first and foremost, the climate challenge. The U.S. national security strategy even goes on to say that the United States must maintain and increase international cooperation on shared challenges, even in an age of greater interstate competition. It goes on to say we will cooperate with any country, including our geopolitical rivals, that's willing to work constructively with us to address shared challenges. I think that's an important corrective to the conversation that's happening right now in Washington that's become obviously very, very pointed with good reason, but nonetheless, I think we need to recognize that we do have some shared global challenges that are going to require a collective approach over time. Indeed, virtually the only meaningful international climate agreement to date, the Paris Climate Accord of 2015, came about following substantive bilateral U.S.-Chinese engagement on climate matters. It feels like a very long time ago now, but in November of 2014, then President Obama and President Xi Jinping stood together in Beijing and made a historic U.S.-China joint announcement on climate change, emphasizing their shared commitment to the issue and making essentially an agreement to make a success of the negotiations in Paris and make climate diplomacy a pillar of bilateral relations moving forward. 2014 feels like a long time ago now, a lot of water under the bridge, and needless to say, circumstances have changed. China has proven reluctant to commit itself further to further action on climate issues in recent years. As Robert alluded, China has instead sought to, I think, counterproductively link unrelated issues together, making clear that it expects concessions on other matters as a prerequisite to cooperating on shared challenges, including climate change. In my view, this isn't a tenable course of action, and it doesn't represent what it means to be a responsible stakeholder in the global system. But China has embraced this delay in terms of making additional progress on international commitments to deal with climate, perhaps to buy time for further fossil fuel-powered economic development. And as China deepens its engagement with Russia, a weakened Russia, it's taking advantage of Moscow's inability to offload its oil and gas in other markets and buying up some of that cut-rate fossil fuels to power its own continued economic development. As other speakers have noted, and as Aaron's report makes clear, this dynamic poses real risks for China itself, which presumably doesn't want to go down the path of environmental degradation that really the USSR ultimately became a kind of byword for. As China's environment degrades, imposing additional costs on Chinese society and the health of its citizens, some Chinese may begin to wonder whether the Communist Party, which doesn't have the foundational legitimacy of democratically elected leadership, has lost the so-called mandate of heaven. This is, of course, this 1,000-year-old Chinese notion that unjust and unworthy rulers are punished by exactly the sorts of droughts, storms, famines, and other disasters that a rapidly warming planet has in store for China and for much of the globe. And I think we saw some of these sensitivities coming to light in the way that the Chinese dealt with the challenge of COVID-19. And we saw this vicious cycle playing out over the last year in China, where global warming contributed to a really acute drought, which led to less available hydroelectric power because the rivers weren't flowing the way they would normally, which of course led the Chinese to burn more coal, which contributes to more warming. And the cycle repeats. I think that's a dangerous dynamic to find yourself in, whether you're China or any other major economy. While China, many in Washington are currently lamenting the fact that China has a commanding position with respect to the production and processing of rare earth minerals, we should bear in mind that Chinese mining practices and the CCP's broader emphasis on economic growth at all costs has resulted in toxic air and water in much of China, which may yet give rise to increasing domestic protest and instability. China's continued reliance on environmental exploitation, not only on land, but in the oceans in terms of its engagement in illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, its fossil fuel-enabled economic growth poses risks to the rest of the world as well. We're all going to bear the burden of China's continued world-leading contributions to global warming at this point. Others have noted that China's may increasingly divert scarce Himalayan water sources and further despoil the global commons, including in unexploited but resource-rich parts of the world like an increasingly accessible Arctic region, these steps could lead to increased risk of international conflict. And in the Pentagon, where we spend each and every day thinking about risks to global stability, these issues are more and more front of mind. As I think Robert and others have alluded, despite its foot dragging on climate matters over the last several years, China still pretends that it's at common purposes with the low-emitting, less developed countries of the quote-unquote global South. I regret that, I think history will judge that the temporary withdrawal by the United States from the Paris Climate Accord was an own goal that enabled China to effectively position itself in this manner. But it's time for the United States to diplomatically correct this narrative. And I think we've got an interesting case study in terms of the diplomatic savvy required to have these sorts of conversations in the case of the way the U.S. Embassy in Beijing operated in the lead up to the Beijing Olympics in 2008. Many around this table will recall that it was in this period that the Chinese government was very clearly falsifying its reporting on air quality data in Beijing and claiming a completely unrealistic number of blue sky days in Beijing when that was self-evidently not the case in this kind of Orwellian situation at the time. And so the U.S. Embassy in Beijing took it upon itself to put a sensor, a monitor, on top of the embassy in Beijing that measured for itself the percentage of particulate matter in the air in Beijing, and then began publicizing that figure on its Twitter account, which led to more and more interest in this issue. The fact that it coincided with the Beijing Olympics, of course, was an irritant to the Chinese, and ultimately the dynamic led to the Chinese being forced to be much more transparent and attentive to issues of urban air quality. So I think that's a example of a powerful kind of low-cost kind of public relations intervention that can bear real fruit. And we need to think about how we can use similar tools in that way. We also need to be thoughtful about how we can up our game when it comes to supporting allies and partners with respect to building their climate resilience and enhancing their capacity to predict and respond to climate-related threats. As we have this kind of competition for support in much of the developing world, we need to use the tools at our disposal thoughtfully, and that includes, in the recent National Defense Authorization Act, there is a new authority for the Defense Department known as the Defense Operational Resilience International Cooperation, or Doric Authority. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it authorizes up to $10 million a year for the Defense Department to work with partner and allied militaries to enhance climate resilience. I think this is an important start, and it really needs to be married up with other initiatives across the U.S. government, including the President's Prepare Initiative or the State Department's Foreign Military Financing Program, various initiatives at the U.S. Agency for International Development right here in this building, as well as the other Department of Defense security cooperation authorities that I've certainly worked with a great deal in the past. Now, I don't think the United States can or should be making investments in infrastructure, for example, here, there, and everywhere to respond to China's approach or take a kind of one-to-one kind of correspondence approach to dealing with these issues. But I do think we should be making targeted investments in the capabilities of critical allies and partners to withstand rising seas, more powerful storms, more frequent disasters, particularly in these increasingly strategic locations like Southeast Asia and the Pacific Island nations, where these threats are really bordering on existential. Finally, I'll close by noting, because this question comes up a lot, that the Department of Defense doesn't believe there are trade-offs to be made between adapting to climate change within our own force and maintaining our focus on sustaining and strengthening deterrence vis-a-vis China or other actors that threaten U.S. allied and partner interests. The significant investments the Defense Department is making in breakthrough technologies and enhancing the energy efficiency of our platforms, our operations, and our installations all go toward increasing the U.S. military's resilience, agility, and lethality. These initiatives are good for the planet, and they help maintain the Joint Forces warfighting edge, which of course is a central focus for the Department of Defense. As the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary of Defense on down have all made clear, the militaries and societies that best adapt to the changing strategic environment will have the advantage in the strategic competition that will define the decades ahead. So I'll stop there and really look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Greg. Jennifer, over to you. I don't know if that might need to switch.
I need to swap.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, so, Erin, I was super happy. I'm a water person. I mean, I did my dissertation research in China in 1994 and was tromping around looking at the politics around local government relations, on, how local governments could be naughty and sometimes do bottom-up water policies. And sometimes Water Bureau people took me to temples that were being built to Yu the Great. The emperor, the great water manager. So it's just like they remember the lessons that, managing water, it's very important for stability in the country. And then, as you just mentioned, we had the heat wave from hell last year, right? So for like 3 months, it was like 112 degrees, size of couple Texases. And, so mid and lower Yangtze River communities, I mean, the water was drying up. And keep in mind, this is, your climate hazard plus situation, I think, because already, I mean, China has dammed the bejeebies out of the upstream of the Yangtze River.
It's a technical term.
It is technical, yes. I hung out with hydrologists. The largest dam built out in the world. And they also have the world's largest water transfer project, moving water out of the same basin. And for many years, they'd been land reclamation over the wetlands and the lakes there. I mean, it's a water ecosystem disaster, and then you literally light the fire and wandanla, right? It's a really stressful situation, and of course, the People's Liberation Army had to come in and, we're delivering water, and they opened up the dams, and the scenario that you said, this catch-22, we need more. So then, of course, and keeping in mind, too, that the glaciers are melting. I mean, this is a crisis. Now, I should note one thing on the good side. I mean, China, I think they're the only country in the world, under their 3 red line policy, they're the only country in the world that has a cap on yearly water consumption. They've got this target and pushing for water energy efficiency, reducing water pollution. I mean, and again, it's on paper, but they have been making lots of progress on the waterfront, if you don't mind the pun there. But water, it is their biggest environmental, economic, and social problem. And also a lot of that has to, the concern about agriculture too, about being able to feed their people. And just kind of want to interject in there, because just to jump to Erin before I forget it, that you said that, exploring areas for mutual climate benefit in terms of instability. The US and China, we are the world's food superpowers. And notably on the food sector, ag, we don't actually compete head to head. We actually export a lot of our food to China. But both countries are, there's concerns about, rural development, soil health, agricultural production, and there are scientists on both U.S. and China who have been working, sometimes even still together, on some of these issues of ag and food sustainability. And I think that, and it was mentioned in the Glasgow, U.S.-China Glasgow Climate Declaration, there was a tiny little note that said that we would work together on climate and ag. Don't know what that means. Just as a full disclosure, I have a new project focused on U.S.-China climate and ag, and it seems to be kind of in looking for an area. I mean, this is a domestic in both countries issue, but this kind of where we're not competing and there's a benefit to both countries. Sorry, little side note there. Another kind of, we can go more, but let's talk about overseas coal. In September 2021, Xi Jinping, he surprised us. He does that a lot, doesn't he, Robert? Xi Jinping. Yeah, he surprised us with the announcement that they were going to ban coal-fired power plant investments overseas. And in the reality, some countries had been turning away from the coal-fired power plants anyway. BRI investment had been going down by this point. But still, it was a good surprise. But then a month later, here's 2 stories, 2 diverging stories. One was in Songwa, there's in North Zimbabwe, there's a big coal-fired power plant that the Chinese there's 2 major banks were working on financing. I mean, Zimbabwe is really, really energy short. The 2 banks decided to pull the plug on the projects a month after this announcement. Now, I was really struck that they did that, because before then, it was already a really risky project. I mean, the Chinese realized when they built this coal-fired power plant, it needed water, but don't worry, we can build a water transfer project, 250-mile pipeline from a lake that's shared between Zambia and Zimbabwe, which is used for hydropower. So it's like the same kind of situation. We're going to drain the lake that's supplying hydropower. And there was also a lot of opposition to it. But this was the first time that we had Chinese banks, citing, they right away said, okay, because he said this, we're pulling the plug. The other one is that same time period is that in Indonesia, a Chinese state-owned enterprise decided that they would start building like a $560 million coal gasification plant. I don't know if you know, China has a lot of coal, right? Coal for power. They also, for years, have been developing coal gasification, coal to chemicals. Coal to ice cream is coming down the pike, I'm sure, at some point. But so China has the technologies for coal gasification, and Indonesia, #1 thermal coal exporter, seen the tide that coal-fired power plant's bad, so they just they're shifting. Because if you look at Xi Jinping's ban, he specified coal-fired power plants. Mm-hmm. So it's not in this, so while by what he said, they're obeying, but in the spirit of a coal ban, the coal gasification isn't happening. But the Indonesian government is very much encouraging this. I'll stop because maybe in the Q&A I can give you lots more stories of, we could talk about Chinese dams, which, So domestically, though, China's working very hard on, preserving their water. There's a Yangtze River protection law, there's a wetland protection law, so they're doing a lot to starting to protect their natural resources. I guess one last point, they're talking more in the last couple of years about nature-based solutions to climate change, and because they see it as a necessity at home, and now they're talking about they want to take this overseas, and we don't know what that means yet. So I will leave that hanging there. I was a little more cheery than you.
A little bit.
A little bit.
I want to give you all a chance to chime in with any reflections on the other panelists' remarks, if anything came to mind while your panelists were speaking. Do you want to respond? Go ahead.
Well, I've been struck for a number of years, I'm sure this group already knows this, that when I first got involved in U.S.-China relations at the embassy, there was a sense that we were pulling or dragging China toward environmental consciousness, and that is long since not true. There's an awful lot of grassroots, bottom-up pressure, such that I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that we're not in this tutors and tutee position anymore on this. China doesn't do what it does because of U.S. pressure. It does what it does for human welfare within China because of pressure they get from their own people, and I just wanted to make sure that that was on the table. Thanks.
And should note what the U.S. Embassy put in that censor. There were Chinese NGOs who simultaneously were renting hand air quality monitoring equipment, attaching them to kites, and also doing a similar kind of act, because they too, it's like, no one could breathe, no one could see in that air. So yeah, but it was really kind of a 1-2 punch with the embassy and the grassroots and community folks.
Erin.
Sure. No, I appreciate Robert's point just now that, and part of the reason when we did this paper was I think there was a lot of conversation in Washington around the mitigation piece that somehow the U.S. would really drive Chinese behavior on whether it would cut emissions or not. And I just don't think that's true. I think China's driven, as you said, by its own internal understanding of the risks and what it needs to do for its population. And so I think that's why the United States has to understand those risks. I also wanted to respond, Robert, I also agree that it's critical to understand the environment, the competitive environment, security environment in which we're operating as the background for relations on climate issues, and absolutely any effort to try and bring folks across that divide. It's not just about the security people understanding the environment, it's the environment people understanding the security dimensions there. Two other quick things. You mentioned this exporting of the domestic policing capacity. And I do think when we talk about climate security, right, and different visions of climate security, I think there's an argument to be made that China's vision of climate security is being able to manage internal responses and instability, and they want to export that vision elsewhere. And so I think it's important for the United States to think about what's our vision that we want to export elsewhere as well and help other countries, because otherwise there are these options that China may be offering that go beyond the energy piece, but to the how do you manage in this potentially really dystopic world. The last thing I'll say, listening to you talk, Jennifer, makes me think of some work we did when I was on the National Intelligence Council and really trying to understand what makes a country resilient. right? Whether it's resilient to climate hazards or resilient to something like the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's so much focus on physical interventions, right? If we build these seawalls or we build this water transfer system and it's the best and the biggest, right? That's what will manage these risks, but that's just one piece of it. There's a whole other side of resilience that is much less tangible, frankly, and much more about trust in government. It's about political polarization in a country, right? It's about inclusive political institutions, which again, we saw with COVID-19, that those things were really important for countries to have. And I think that's where I see a lot of potential risk for China comparatively on these issues.
Go ahead.
Just two quick points. As Jennifer and others have noted, the Chinese have a pretty impressive history when it comes to these massive physical projects and the sort of ambition to move water across massive distances in their country and now in other countries. It's fairly breathtaking on one level. And it's notable that historically the way to the top of the Chinese Communist Party was by being an engineer. And many in the top ranks of the CCP are, in fact, engineers by training. But I think, China, like the United States, is going to have to do some thinking as to the degree to which, as Aaron notes, we'll have the potential to engineer our way out of the challenges of climate change. And Aaron's report does include a brief note on the temptation of geoengineering. And for those who look at this as a sort of equation to be solved rather simplistically, there will be a temptation there. And I think that there are real risks associated with international relations when it comes to geoengineering. That's not our topic for today, but it's certainly something that I think we all need to bear in mind and do some hard thinking about the degree to which those sorts of measures are manageable or appropriate as compared to dealing with some of the root challenges of decarbonization. The only other note that I'll sound here, just to build off of what Jennifer said about the intersection of climate and agriculture. In this week's, or maybe last week's now, Economist magazine, there's a front page story about how U.S.-China relations, to Robert's point, are worse than it seems. And it's worth reading that, although I don't know that there's a whole lot of new insights there. Perhaps more interesting to my mind is the story deep in the sort of middle of the magazine about declining rice yields across Asia and the degree to which climate change is contributing to that. So I think in China, in India, in much of Asia, and the wider world, we need to be thinking very seriously about these risks and the ways in which climate is going to intersect with agriculture and what that's going to mean for societal stability.
That's a great point. Robert.
Just one more quick note. Also, The Economist does some of the best reporting on China. It's sort of one of the places to go to. I know it's expensive, but I think it's worth it. But I wanted to ask, I guess, maybe Jennifer, for you, to what degree increasingly issues of climate and environment in China have a class character. The report talks a lot about potential for social disruption, and it's my understanding that increasingly, as in the United States, the wealthy elites are pushing filthier air, filthier water inland to second and third tier cities. They have big NIMBY issues, but there isn't really a dialogue that I know of climate justice there, of the sort that we have, inadequate as it is here. It's nascent, it's coming. There, because it has a dangerous class character, I'm not even sure how much they're talking about it, but is that something that should be part of this discussion? Thanks.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Years ago, I had a study tour of U.S. and Chinese folks. It was on environmental justice, and when they all came together, we realized that we had to figure out how to translate it into Chinese. I mean, we could translate the words, but the concept wasn't there. And I mean, in China, it's very much, it is a class, more of a class issue. It's not a race issue. It
Right.
tends, well, it's class and race here. Okay. Yeah, I think that there's, I mean, one thing that's kind of linked to that I'm concerned with that you mentioned in your report, Aaron, is that the shrinking space for environmental activism. I mean, I was just thinking, like in 2004, when a bunch of Chinese NGOs and journalists sounded the alarm on dams that were going to be built on the Nujiang, the angry river, which is the Salween, and it led to all kinds of photo exhibitions, and Chinese papers reported on it, and Wen Jiabao halted constructions of the dams, and, ready for it? No one got arrested. Okay, and for until that was 2004, and then by 10 years later, they still hadn't built dams. There'd been a little bit of like upstream, littler dams, and there's been talk in the last few years of damming. This is the last wild flowing river from China goes into Myanmar. But now I thought that just as, so for some reason that held. But I still see that there's.
We haven't seen Chai-Jing again since Under the Dome.
We have
right?
not seen Chai-Jing,
It's just-
yeah. But in general, I mean, the Chinese NGOs, the environmental NGOs, and there's a lot of US groups that are there as well. I mean, while they may be a little bit more constrained, the government sees that there's a need for them. So they don't have as much space. But one quick thing on the sallowing to note is that in the last couple of years, the Chinese are now going across the border and, partnering with the Thai. So they might be starting to build dams that will start hurting the sallowing, to divert the water and dam it. But no, it's still interesting to me that they haven't done it in mainland yet.
I'm going to go ahead and open us up for Q&A because we have a number of questions that have come in online, and I know we have a number of questions in the room. So we'll start in the room. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions, if there are 2 or 3 questions to start with, and then we'll do a round from online. I'm going to ask you to use a microphone, push the button so that it's green, so that the folks watching online can hear you as well, and we'll start over here. Yep, please
It's green on the base.
push it one more time.
Push it one more time.
And then please share your title or your name and affiliation, please.
My name is Stephen Andrews. I'm an attorney. I'm currently self-employed. Thank you so much for a great panel, great report. I know Jennifer Turner in particular, 25 years of incredible work, sort of increasing U.S.-China cooperation. I think it's so important. My question is, I'm really concerned, and this has sort of been a long-term issue, and sort of, I saw Brian Eller from the Stimson Center testify the Congressional Subcommittee in the end of December, talking about his number one recommendation was, increasing science and transparency activities. And sort of my question or concern is that I'd like you to respond to is about the risks to academics, to civil society, even to businesses by framing and discussing about climate change as a national security issue. And in particular, I mean, I've worked and sort of been involved in, I mean, many of you know the American geologist Shui Feng. So this was back in, so I think 2007. He was detained for buying, natural resources data, a case that Obama ended up getting involved in. But I mean, even more recently, I know International Crisis Group, Michael Kovrig, who was detained, he wasn't doing climate change related work, but again, he wasn't doing, what would typically be thought of national security work. And so for me, I think, this cooperation is so important. And sort of even looking at this panel, I know often, there's Chinese academics, Chinese civil society, Chinese government officials sometimes, and here, there's no Chinese officials. And so I'm concerned, by talking about national security risks, you're making the Chinese government, I'm concerned that the Chinese government will be even less willing to share data. And so I'm curious in the possible risks then, people doing academic research, PhD student, American PhD student doing research, Chinese geologic, topographic maps are still, classified. So how do we encourage, the Chinese government to share this data when discussing, national security or direct risks to military infrastructure? So that's something I'm almost like, I don't want to know about that, because then, just the risk. So again, thank you so much, and it'd be great if you could respond to that.
That's a great question. In the back there.
Yes, hello. My name is Aldo Simone. I'm a commander for the Italian Navy. I'm here in the United States as a liaison officer, but I'm here in my personal capacity. So it was a fascinating panel. At some point, it reminded me of the Chinese movie Hero, when the same story was told with different perspective and point of view, using different colors and different style. Very interesting. My question is for Mr. Daly, and it's about the Cold War, the new so-called Cold War. Reminded me of the MAD acronym from the 1980s, mutually assured destruction, but this time would be probably about climate instead of nuclear weapons, very likely. But there's a main difference because the United States government is accountable for its operate to the American people, and every contradiction can be easily pointed out, while China can count on strategic ambiguity in their way of doing things. So they can Sometimes they can say, I'm a climate leader, I'm doing all these beautiful things, but then when something happens, they will weaponize climate, like during the Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, they threatened to halt climate conversation. So they were basically using climate talks as retaliation or weaponization. So on this uneven basis, my question is, how could competition grant a better impact on climate change, starting from this uneven basis? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. One more in the back.
Hi, I'm Mia from Radio Free Asia. I've probably exchanged some emails and phone calls with some of you. I have a question I probably just follow up that, so now we have China supporting other countries building harbors, building highways, and then turned out that they probably don't have enough money to pay back, and we have China now have the control over those infrastructures. And how do we stop this from probably 20 years and we look back and see, oh no, like China now owns the Amazon forest, now they own the volcanoes. How do we work with China, especially like between the US and China, but stop from them to like build up another, let's say like BRI 2.0 in like 20 years?
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to the panel, and then we'll go online, and I'll come back to in the room. So the first question, sort of the risks of framing climate change as a national security issue and how that might undermine efforts to actually have some of that data gathering and transparency. I'm going to go to you first, Jennifer.
Me first?
Yeah.
That seemed like an Aaron question. Dang.
Sorry, Jennifer.
No, I mean, it is tricky right now because the question that, a lot of, even before COVID, a lot of researchers, Americans, and, I'm sure you sense it too, sometimes going to China that you'd go to a university and they'd have to meet you off campus because there's some kind of, just a little bit suspicion going on. But I want to pass this one to Aaron.
Okay, that's
I feel
fine.
bad.
Go ahead.
I'm going to pass it. Like my call for help.
No, it's a tough question, and I think it's certainly something to be conscious of. I also think that we're at a point with climate change, however, and given what we know of the trajectory and the intensity of the hazards, that we can't ignore it as a security issue either, because we'll get our security answers wrong, right? We'll get our security strategy wrong, and we'll miss things. I think that, but we need to be responsible in how we talk about it, and we need to leave room for academic collaboration, and we need to highlight opportunities for collaboration too, which is why I was really keen to make sure there was a point on that in the report itself. I think pointing, and we talk about this domestically in the US, pointing something out as a security risk doesn't mean that the military is the answer to that security risk necessarily, right? We need a whole of government, all tools in our toolbox response. I also think, and I am, far from a expert on China like some of the other panelists here, but I also think the responsibility for treating academics, properly also falls on China itself, right? And so we can do what we can in our framing and our engagement, but there's, it's two sides to the issue.
I can add here that also keep in mind, like, Chinese NGOs and also a lot of the international NGOs that have been working in China for a long time, they do know how to watch themselves and to check what they do and not go too far, and a lot of the work that both international and Chinese green groups in China, they're often working in partnership with governments. So it's not saying that they've been co-opted, but a lot of the government's own environmental pollution, climate goals really sync with the kinds of action that a lot of environmental groups want to do. But I think, there's still, they have to take care more so than they had to in the past. You about to interject?
Yeah, Robert or Greg?
My personal view on this is that if I were invited by the right kind of Chinese work unit, a think tank or university, to go back to China to do lectures or discussions, I would certainly go. I don't want anyone else going to China on my say-so. So I'm not advising anyone else to do it, but I would go if I was satisfied that I would stay within my visa limits. I think that there is hostage taking, there are real concerns about access and archives, but I don't think we're yet at the point where American NGO folks, academics are in really great danger of being swept up off the street. I don't think we're there yet, and it's not in China's interest.
Great. Greg, did you want to chime in?
I'll just say really briefly, I appreciate the reference to Michael Kovrig. I actually began my career in this business at the International Crisis Group myself, and so I'm well aware of the immense risk that those types of researchers take in certain parts of the world, not only in China and elsewhere. And much the same could be said about journalists and human rights activists. As we sit in Washington and think about these strategic issues, I have a huge amount of respect for the folks who are on the front lines of driving, social and political and economic change around the world in those kinds of roles. I also think, it's important that we be thoughtful here in this moment here in the United States about the way we talk about the presence of Chinese students here inside the United States, lest we essentially give China cover for expanding its approach to, expelling or monitoring or detaining those trying to do important academic, scientific, and other research in China. It's not to say that there aren't risks in that space, but it's something that we have to be thoughtful about. I don't know if we're taking the
Yeah, go
questions
ahead
in
with
turn.
the other questions if you'd like. Sure.
Yeah, just really briefly, I do, to the question from the back of the room, I do think there are real concerns that the Chinese are essentially holding this issue hostage in some sense, hoping that they can leverage the fact that the United States is keen to try to drive more progress internationally on the climate challenge, and hope that it can enable them to win concessions on other issues, potentially including Taiwan or other sensitive issues for Beijing. I think that's something that we need to be thoughtful about how we characterize the Chinese approach on, and make it clear kind of who's responsible for holding up progress on international climate negotiations in this regard. I do think there is a case to be made, and I'll let Robert maybe explore it in more detail, that this idea that societal level competition could in fact be good or beneficial in terms of developing the sorts of breakthrough technologies that will enable us to deal with the climate challenge. I think the conversations happening right now around, for example, battery technologies and onshoring or reshoring or ally shoring of battery technologies and other key technologies with respect to decarbonization, that could be an example where there's a more of a race to the top. That said, I think that's still a little bit of a speculative theory of the case, in that we aren't seeing for the most part most major economies meeting their existing climate commitments, and we need to see more progress across the board. But I think it's worth exploring the idea and ways we could structure dialogue to facilitate more of that kind of beneficial competition, as opposed to competition being merely a byword for the security dynamics between the U.S. and China. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, I mean, it's often lamented and has been for the past few years that we can't cooperate on climate change. You hear this. We flunked the alien invasion test with pandemic, and we flunked it with climate change as well. But of course, and so there's sort of a facile sense that, we could be cooperating more on climate change, where it's really not cooperation so much as parallel action, right? Only they can reduce their emissions and only we can reduce ours. And so when we speak of cooperation, what we really mean is symbolically standing shoulder to shoulder to encourage the rest of the world to move along. It's not the kind of, we haven't had the kind of, and you'll tell me I'm wrong immediately if on this, but real cooperation would be something like we had after SARS, where our CDCs were involved in each other's machinery, shoulder to shoulder and working together. And with climate change, I'm not sure we're talking about that. On the competition side, it's early days, and I agree with Greg that this is a little bit tentative. But we do have to be watchful. China is positioned to provide a lot more global public goods if it wants to. What's astounding is that it doesn't do it very often. It's easy. It's right there. They built and militarized these South China Sea islands and said, well, we're going to use these as a public good. Well, do it. If I were the leader of China, I'd just be champing at the bit for a hurricane to come so that I could dispatch a medical ship from one of these islands to the Philippines. And they seem to miss this again and again. But they can, we see now with them Sherpaing a kind of agreement to reopen embassies between Riyadh and Tehran. That was low-hanging fruit, didn't really cost China anything, it was risk-free. But they want to provide more global public goods. And I think this is very smart policy because it's in China's interest to complicate the Western narrative. The Western narrative is now very, very simple. It goes like this: China bad, right? And that's getting more and more adherents. And so you would want to complicate the narrative through global public goods, including in combating climate change. China has a very difficult time doing such things without being so transparently self-regarding that they offend as many people as they help. But that could change, and so we need to be alert to the fact that China could actually be doing more. Many in the security apparatus here would find that galling, but it nevertheless could be very real, and it's something I think we need to pay attention to. I'm amazed that China's been, as clumsy as it has been in not taking those opportunities to date.
Should note in the Obama administration that we were working together, government, NGO, business, and researchers on a lot of different climate issues. I mean, particularly like, the country of California and China, about, things about the EV.
I think it's the People's Republic of California.
But I mean, that China's, their EV boom that they have, I mean, they studied California's zero emissions program and worked with the California Air Resources Board. Same thing for their emission trading system. I mean, there has been intimate, like, subnational cooperation between U.S. and China. And so, yeah, I mean, and it did spark kind of a race to the top, too. But yeah, it's similar to that CDC thing, but then it, poof, seemed to disappear.
All right, I'm going to ask some questions that have come in online, and I'm having a hard time winnowing them down, so bear with me. But one is from John Conger, a senior advisor at the Council on Strategic Risks. Given the comments that China will not act on climate in response to U.S. pressure, what would motivate them to accelerate and prioritize climate efforts? What kinds of actions will climate security risks elevate in priority for China? A second question from Taylor Roth, National Security Specialist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. In your view, what are the biggest asymmetries between the United States and China in terms of their adaptive capacity to climate change hazards? And a third question from, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Saring. China's interventions in neighboring countries have had negative impacts on transboundary natural resources and bodies of water. This will also impact China, as China cannot remain immune from what happens in Central Asia or Pakistan. So how will China cope with external threats? So thinking a little bit more broadly beyond the U.S.-China relationship, but other actors in the world stage. So I'm just going to go down the line, I think, in the interest of time, and I'm going to ask you to keep your just kind of short so we can do another round in the room. And Robert, can I start with you? So thinking about, are there kinds of actions that could motivate China to accelerate and prioritize climate efforts?
I'm going to mostly pass to the experts on this.
Okay.
As I said, but they're self-motivated. It's not something that we can do.
Right. Okay. Okay. From within China.
Yeah.
Okay, Jennifer?
And yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with that, but I also still think that this kind of competitive race to the top, it can be a motivator. And again, it just lights the fire.
How do you manage that balance, though, of sort of that internal motivation, but also the power dynamics within the country that can stifle some of that grassroots action? Like, is there a balance to be had there?
Well, in the case of air, and this is going back now a good 15, 20 years when this first came up, it was simply undeniable. I mean, and this is why the Chinese themselves would say this is the perfect crisis, because the wealthy and the connected can buy their way out of the medical crisis, the education crisis, food safety, water safety, but we have to breathe the same air. Right. And this was, it couldn't be entirely undemocratic. On one of my last days in Nanjing in 2007, we had 4 days of toxic fog, a weather pattern that we don't have here, where it was just brown all day long, and everybody had to stay inside. And so it was so bad that there was no sweeping it under the rug.
Right. Jennifer, what about you just were in Central Asia, so what about how China might cope with the sort of regional and transboundary threats that come from climate and responses to climate as well?
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny because when I was there giving talks at different universities, talking about what China does, and I found that I mean, I think the cross-boundary water issues, and I need to learn more about it, but that was the one that was the most sensitive, and also I was really struck with how a lot of people it was funny, I was invited to come and talk about China, and people didn't always want to talk about China with me, that it was kind of sensitive, and even something also striking was that how, I'd have conversations with people, and there didn't seem to be an awareness that China was actually, that there was Belt and Road projects in their countries. This is Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. I'm thinking like, there are projects, but it just, their own governments kind of, it seems, keep it quiet. And I found that kind of striking. So, but I think that what I'm not seeing that there doesn't seem to be like we have between the U.S. and China, like as much of the scientists and the NGOs kind of having these kind of subnational kinds of conversations, and that kind of sent off a little danger signal to me, because I'm like, oh, you got, if the government's not willing to talk about it with each other. So and I didn't really see any major, even gov-to-gov initiatives around it. So that's a bit of a concerning matter.
Greg, if you want to chime in on those questions, and then this question about the adaptive capacity to climate hazards in the United States and China and the asymmetries, but I also wanted to see if you wanted to comment on the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. I don't know if that's in your portfolio necessarily, but like thinking about some of what the U.S. has, the steps that the U.S. has taken, not necessarily to respond to China abroad, but to increase the climate resilience of our allies and partners and those in the low and middle income countries, recognizing that there is a pretty large gap there, right? And how sort of U.S. efforts are in place in that regard.
Yeah, I'll try to stitch a couple different threads here together. Going back, I think, to the question that we didn't really answer around concerns about debt trap diplomacy, and Robert's point that China actually has the potential to provide a lot more in terms of global public goods than it does. I don't necessarily think, if China is contributing to, for example, international peacekeeping or development in places like Africa, where I saw a lot of this firsthand, I don't think that's in and of itself a bad thing. In fact, it could very much be a good thing. If China is building airports and stitching together economies and communities that haven't been historically in a way that redounds to the benefit of those local states or communities, I think that's a good thing, in the same way that it is when the U.S. or the Europeans contribute to international development. The problem comes when it's much more exploitative and extractive and potentially for dual use purposes. And when we see evidence of that, our diplomatic apparatus swings into action and really tries hard to make sure that our allies and partners, or even the fence sitters in the global system, go into these deals with their eyes open. And we have seen cases where the Chinese have translated some initial economic investment into kind of strategic advantage in ways that hasn't benefited those host nations. So I think that's something that we need to be mindful of, and certainly something that those entering into these kinds of deals with China need to be thoughtful about. But we shouldn't necessarily see every Chinese development project as a sort of national security threat in and of itself. We need to look at them case by case. I agree with others who noted that in terms of motivating Chinese action on climate issues, it's going to come first and foremost from domestic pressure within China. And I also think that there's something to be said for the global South, quote unquote, calling China to account for its role, and removing this fig leaf that somehow China is one with the Vanuatu's and the Tanzanias or wherever, in terms of being a developing country, because that's just not tenable. In terms of the asymmetries with respect to adaptation, I think there's a few. This is a really interesting question, I think, and we could probably spend much of the rest of our hour sort of talking it through. But in China, I think they do have some very specific challenges around the urban-rural divide, and the fact that climate kind of compounds those economic and class divides within China. It lends itself to additional challenges. I also think the number and range of neighboring states that China has on its borders, land borders, is different from the relationships the United States has here in North America, and that's going to result in certain additional challenges. I think many have pointed out that China has a command and control kind of governance and economic model still to some degree, and that makes decision making far less messy, at least on the outside, than it appears sometimes here in Washington. But I do think there's an asymmetry there for the United States, an asymmetrical advantage in that when crises do come, I think on balance, when democratic societies are able to cohere, and this is something that I think we need to continue working on here in the United States, we do have the capacity for immense resilience. And I think where decision-making is really concentrated, you see societies become brittle in the context of crises. And I think that's something that authoritarian societies everywhere, should be concerned about.
Thank you, Greg. Aaron?
Sure. On this question of motivation and how does China get motivated to take action, I agree with the previous commenters that it is about domestic pressure. I also think it's about economic opportunity and the recognition by Chinese leadership that there is economic advantage in investing in clean energy and the energy transition. And I think you see that in some of the leadership conversation. But I think just like the United States and elsewhere, there's that tension between the problems today of getting energy where it needs to go and the very real recognition of the risks that climate change poses long term. But I think there is a recognition at some level that they can't maintain their position or achieve their other national security goals without addressing climate in some way. So I think that also motivates leadership action. In terms of the asymmetries, I agree with Greg. I do think, China, the fact that I mentioned earlier, they have a national climate adaptation plan and they're thinking long-term about these public works investments. Frankly, we don't see that same kind of focus on adaptation domestically here in the United States, and certainly not coordinated at the national level. There's been some push to develop a national climate adaptation plan, but that hasn't occurred yet, and I think that's a real problem, frankly, for the United States. I do think, though, our focus, increasing focus, and it's not perfect by any means, but more attention to climate and environmental justice in the U.S. is an advantage we have there, and that community kind of bottom-up push. I think if we attend to that correctly and leverage it, it is a benefit that we have. The last thing I'll say is on this question of Chinese investments abroad and development investment and China's deals that are loans and predatory. I think it's not enough, obviously, for the United States just to critique those deals, but also we need to be able to offer an alternative. And this is where I think there's a lot of room for the U.S. to improve its ability to offer that alternative. We saw last year in the omnibus spending bill at the end of the year from Congress that they did not increase funding for climate finance at all from the United States. I think that was a real missed opportunity for the U.S., and I think finding ways to invest in climate finance abroad, again, not to try and match every program that China's doing dollar for dollar or come up with that kind of tit for tat, but instead looking very strategically at allies and partners, because the programs Greg mentioned, which are great, like Doric and Prepare and other things, but they're not nearly enough, right? And we're kind of in a situation with some of those where we're robbing Peter to pay Paul a little bit internally within, I think, USAID and the State Department. And so new funding is needed, and new funding is needed because it's a national security imperative for the United States, not just because it's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Aaron. Let's take one more in the room.
Thank you. If I tell you who I am and where I came from, it would take the rest of our hour. But once upon a time, I was next door at USA Director of Agriculture. And in 1999, we had our annual Green Revolution meeting in China. And I was struck by a number of things. The degree to which the Chinese depended on the Taiwanese to catch up and beat the Indians in Green Revolution, particularly the wheat and rice thing. And they were I think the most user-friendly in terms of beta-carotene golden rice, which was resisted by my colleagues at AID because the pharmaceuticals were pressuring AID. But I won't tell you what I've been doing since, but it's all been in climate change. Anyway, the second thing I was struck with at the meeting was the interest of the Chinese in